Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The ad on Craigslist seemed perfect for someone drowning in student loans like me. $400 a month for a room in a house near campus, utilities included, with 3 other roommates to split the common areas. I'd just turned 23 that April, and after burning through most of my savings on textbooks and ramen, this place felt like a miracle. The landlord, Walter Garrison, met me at the front door on move-in day with a clipboard and a grin that stretched too wide across his face. He walked me through the house, pointing out the thermostat I shouldn't touch, the dishwasher that only worked on the light cycle, and the basement door at the end of the hallway. "Storage down there," he said, jangling his keys. "Each tenant gets a section, but that back room stays locked. Just old tools and equipment from when my father owned the place." I didn't think much about it those first few weeks. Between my nursing program clinicals and my part-time job at the campus bookstore, I barely had time to sleep, let alone worry about locked doors and basements. My roommates were decent enough people who kept to themselves. There was Bradley, an engineering student who lived on energy drinks and barely left his room. Natalie, who worked nights at a call center and slept during the day. And Jerome, who was finishing his MBA and spent most weekends at his girlfriend's place. We crossed paths in the kitchen occasionally, nodded politely, and went about our lives. The house had that weird quality old rentals have, where every floorboard announces your presence, and the walls seem too thin for privacy, but somehow you still feel alone. My room sat directly above the basement, second door on the right from the stairs, with a window that faced the neighbor's fence, and let in exactly 45 minutes of sunlight each afternoon. The coughing started on a Monday night in early October. I remember because I'd just submitted a huge pharmacology paper, and was finally allowing myself 8 hours of sleep for the first time in weeks. Around 2 in the morning, this dry, rasping sound pulled me from a dream about missing an exam. At first, I thought it was Bradley down the hall, maybe catching a cold from all those late nights. But as I lay there in the dark, tracking the sound, I realized it was coming from below. Not just below, but directly beneath my bed. The cough had a muffled quality to it, like someone trying to suppress the noise by covering their mouth with fabric or their arm. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, these horrible wheezing bursts that made my chest hurt just listening to them, and then nothing. Complete silence except for the house settling and Natalie's alarm clock going off down the hall for her 3 a.m. shift. The next morning, I caught Walter in the driveway as he was leaving after fixing the garage door. "Hey, quick question," I said, trying to sound casual while holding my coffee mug like a shield between us. "Is there any way someone could be in the basement at night? I heard some weird noises." He barely glanced up from his phone, already walking toward his truck, a beat-up Ford with a cracked windshield and bumper stickers from 3 different political campaigns. "Probably the water heater," he said, climbing into the driver's seat. "Thing's older than you are, makes all kinds of racket when it kicks on. Had it checked last month, completely safe, just noisy." He pulled out before I could mention that water heaters don't usually cough, and I stood there in my pajama pants and oversized sweatshirt, feeling stupid for even asking. For 3 nights, nothing happened. I started to convince myself that maybe I'd dreamed the whole thing, or that sound travels weird in old houses, or that Bradley really did have a cold, and the acoustics just made it seem like it came from below. But that Friday, around midnight, the coughing returned. This time it went on for almost 5 minutes, these wet, desperate sounds that made me think of my grandfather in his last days at the hospice where I'd done my first clinical rotation. I grabbed my phone and recorded it, pressing the device against the floor to catch every wheeze and gasp. When I played it back with headphones, I could hear something else between the coughs, a rustling, like papers or plastic bags being moved around, and what might have been the squeak of old mattress springs. I sent the recording to Jerome since he was the only roommate I'd really talked to, and he responded immediately, even though it was past midnight. "That's definitely not the water heater. We should check it out." Jerome met me in the hallway 5 minutes later, holding a flashlight he'd grabbed from his car and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. We crept down to the basement like teenagers sneaking out after curfew, testing each step to avoid the creaky spots. The basement was exactly what you'd expect from a rental house built in the 70s. Concrete floors, exposed beams, that particular smell of damp cardboard and forgotten things. Our storage sections were clearly marked with masking tape and Sharpie, each tenant's name in Walter's blocky handwriting. Behind a wall of stacked boxes and an old refrigerator that hummed constantly, we could see the locked door. A padlock the size of my fist secured a metal latch that had been added recently, judging by the fresh scratch marks on the worn wood. Jerome aimed his flashlight at the gap beneath the door, and we both saw it at the same time. A thin strip of light, barely visible, like someone inside had a phone charging or a nightlight plugged in. We stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds, just staring at that sliver of light. Then, as if responding to our presence, the light shifted. A shadow passed across it, the unmistakable shape of feet moving on the other side. Jerome grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks, and we both scrambled backward, nearly knocking over a tower of Christmas decoration boxes. Neither of us said anything until we were back upstairs in the kitchen, where Jerome poured himself a glass of water with shaking hands and downed it in one go. "We're calling the cops," he said, already pulling out his phone. But I stopped him, some ridiculous part of my brain still thinking about lease agreements and security deposits and having to find a new place in the middle of the semester. "Let me try Walter one more time," I said. "If he doesn't give me a real answer, then we call." Jerome looked at me like I'd lost my mind, but he put his phone down and waited while I sent Walter a text with the video attached, telling him we knew someone was in the locked room and we needed answers now. Walter showed up 20 minutes later, which should have been my first red flag since he lived 40 minutes away. He was wearing sweatpants and a faded college hoodie, his hair sticking up like he'd just rolled out of bed, but his eyes were wide awake and darting between Jerome and me like he was calculating something. "You kids are being paranoid," he said. But his voice had this thin quality to it, stretched tight like a wire about to snap. "That room's been locked for years. Nobody could possibly be in there." I pulled up the video on my phone, turned the volume all the way up and played the coughing sounds. His face went through this series of expressions, from dismissive to concerned to something I couldn't quite read. "Fine," he finally said, pulling out his keys with dramatic reluctance. "I'll show you there's nothing in there but rusty tools and spider webs, and then I don't want to hear about this again." He started toward the basement stairs, then stopped and turned back to us. "Actually, wait here. Insurance liability and all that. I'll go check and come right back." Jerome and I looked at each other and simultaneously decided we weren't letting him go alone. We followed him down, our footsteps echoing his on the wooden stairs. Walter kept muttering under his breath, something about ungrateful tenants and market-rate rentals, but his hands were trembling as he fumbled with the padlock. The key stuck, and he had to jiggle it 3 times before the lock finally clicked open. He pushed the door inward, and the smell hit us immediately. Not decay or waste, but that concentrated human smell of unwashed clothes and stale breath and something medicinal, like cough syrup or benzocaine lozenges. The room was maybe 8 by 10 feet, with a camping cot pushed against one wall, a battery-powered lantern on an overturned milk crate, and grocery bags lined up along another wall. Empty soup cans were stacked in a corner next to a pile of pill bottles. But the worst part was the ceiling. Someone had drilled tiny holes in precise spots, each one positioned perfectly to look up into the rooms above, into our bedrooms, into our lives. "Oh God," Walter said, and for the first time he seemed genuinely shocked. "Gordon, what have you done?" That's when we heard the toilet flush from the small bathroom. I hadn't even noticed in the corner, just a toilet and sink behind a curtain made from a shower liner. A man emerged, probably in his 50s, wearing a dingy white undershirt and jeans that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. He had Walter's same narrow face but none of his nervous energy, just this hollow resignation like he'd been caught doing something inevitable. "I told you they'd find out," Gordon said to Walter, not even looking at Jerome and me. "Told you the girl's room was too close. She was bound to hear me." He sat down on the cot with a wheeze that turned into another coughing fit, this one lasting almost a minute while Walter stood there with his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. When Gordon finally stopped coughing, he looked directly at me for the first time, and his eyes had this horrible apologetic quality that made my skin prickle. "You take morning showers at 6:15, he said quietly. "Sometimes you sing that song about the astronaut. Pretty voice." Jerome already had his phone out, calling 911 while backing toward the door. I couldn't move, couldn't process that this man, Gordon, had been living beneath me for months, watching through those horrible little holes, knowing my schedule better than I did. Walter started babbling, trying to explain that Gordon was his brother, that he'd lost his job and then his apartment, that it was supposed to be temporary, just a few weeks until he got back on his feet. "He's sick," Walter kept saying, as if that explained everything. "He's got respiratory problems, can't afford doctors. I couldn't just leave him on the street." But Gordon wasn't listening to his brother's excuses. He was looking at the holes in the ceiling with this weird pride, running his fingers along the wood. "Had to be real careful with the placement," he said to no one in particular. "Quarter-inch bit, just enough to see through but not enough for anyone to notice from above. The one over your desk is my favorite. You study so hard, writing all those notes about medications and patient care. Sometimes I pretend you're taking care of me." The police arrived within 10 minutes. 3 cars with lights but no sirens. They took Gordon away first, and he went without resistance, just asked Walter to grab his medications from the milk crate. The officers photographed everything, measured the holes, bagged the empty food containers and pill bottles. One of them, a woman with sergeant stripes, told us we'd all need to give statements, and that the house would be off limits for at least 48 hours while they processed the scene. Walter they arrested too, for criminal facilitation and endangerment. As they led him to the squad car, he kept trying to catch my eye, maybe wanting forgiveness or understanding, but I stared at the ground until the car door slammed shut. Jerome and I sat on the front steps until our other roommates got home. Then we all went to Bradley's girlfriend's apartment, cramming into her living room with sleeping bags and the weird energy of survivors from the same disaster. None of us ever went back to that house except to get our belongings with a police escort. I found a studio apartment the next week that cost twice as much and had terrible water pressure. But the floors were solid concrete and there was no basement, and that was all that mattered. The closing papers for my house came through on a Wednesday morning in late February, and honestly, I should have trusted my gut when the real estate agent kept adjusting her glasses and clearing her throat during the final walkthrough. But after 6 months of crashing on my sister's couch following the divorce, any place with my own walls felt like salvation. The house sat on a quiet cul-de-sac in Riverside Heights, one of those neighborhoods where people still put up seasonal decorations and kids actually played in the yards. Built in 1978, the split level had good bones underneath the outdated wallpaper and worn carpet, nothing that some sweat equity couldn't fix. What really sold me was the price, almost $40,000 under market value, because the previous owner, an elderly woman named Dorothy Brennan, had died in the master bedroom and the family wanted a quick sale. Death didn't bother me. At my age, having just watched my 10-year marriage flatline, I figured I could handle sharing space with whatever energy Dorothy left behind. My first 2 weeks there passed in a blur of unpacking boxes and making lists of everything that needed fixing, from the leaky kitchen faucet to the wood paneling in the den that belonged in a time capsule. The basement became my designated storage area for things I wasn't ready to deal with yet, mostly photo albums and wedding gifts that felt too complicated to sort through. It was your typical unfinished basement, concrete floors and exposed beams, with an ancient furnace that groaned like it was digesting something whenever it kicked on. That's what I told myself when I first heard the noises anyway, just the furnace doing its 45-year-old furnace thing. The sounds usually started around 2 in the morning, these soft creaking noises that drifted up through the heating vents. Old houses make noise, everyone knows that. And after living in a modern apartment complex where I could hear my neighbor's coffee maker through the walls, a few creaks seemed like a fair trade for actual privacy. Everything changed on a Sunday night in March when I went down to grab my winter boots from storage, because the weather guy promised one last snowstorm before spring. The pull-string light barely reached the corners of the basement, casting these long shadows behind the water heater and the massive boiler that looked like something from a submarine movie. Behind the boiler, tucked into a gap between the unit and the wall, I found 3 Marlboro red cigarette butts arranged in a neat little line on the concrete floor. My whole body went rigid, like when you miss a step going downstairs and your stomach does that horrible flip. Nobody in my family smoked, hadn't had a single visitor who smoked, and the home inspector definitely would have mentioned finding cigarette butts during his inspection. Right next to the butts sat a Poland Spring water bottle, the label peeled halfway off, with maybe 2 inches of water still sloshing around inside. The plastic was soft, like someone had been gripping it recently, and when I picked it up with my sleeve pulled over my hand, the water inside was room temperature, not the icy cold you'd expect from something abandoned in a basement for weeks. I told myself Dorothy's family must have left it when they cleared out her belongings, maybe took smoke breaks while sorting through 40 years of accumulated stuff, even though the house had been empty for 3 months before I moved in. But that night, I barely slept, jerking awake every time the heat kicked on or a tree branch scraped the siding. The next morning, I called a locksmith and had him install new deadbolts on every exterior door, the expensive kind that couldn't be picked by some YouTube tutorial. Then I went through every window in the house, checking locks and adding these metal security bars to the basement windows that the guy at Home Depot assured me would stop anyone bigger than a raccoon. For good measure, I started leaving lights on when I went to bed. The kitchen, the hallway. Sometimes the basement too, my electric bill be damned. But even with all that, I kept finding myself standing at the top of the basement stairs at random times, listening for sounds that didn't belong, my hand hovering over the light switch like I was afraid of what I might see if I turned it on. 2 weeks passed without incident, and I had almost convinced myself that I'd overreacted, that living alone after a decade of marriage had made me jumpy and paranoid about normal house stuff. Then came the morning I found my back door unlocked, the one that led from the kitchen to the backyard, the one I specifically remembered checking twice before bed because it had become part of my nightly ritual, along with testing every window latch. The door was still closed, just unlocked. The deadbolt turned to the open position like someone had used a key. My coffee mug slipped right out of my hand, shattering on the linoleum and sending hot coffee across my bare feet. But I barely felt the burn. I grabbed my phone and almost called 911. But what would I say? That my door was unlocked and maybe I was just losing my mind from stress. Instead, I called my brother Kevin, who lived 40 minutes away. And while I waited for him to show up, I sat in my car in the driveway with the engine running, watching my own house like it might suddenly reveal its secrets. Kevin spent 2 hours going through the house with me, checking every closet, every corner, even the crawl space above the garage that required a ladder to access. We found nothing missing, nothing disturbed, just that unlocked door that he suggested might be a faulty mechanism, or maybe I'd forgotten despite being certain, absolutely certain, that I'd checked it. But when we went down to the basement to check the window locks, we found something that made Kevin stop talking mid-sentence about getting me a security system. Behind the boiler, in that same spot where I'd found the cigarettes, sat a McDonald's bag, grease-stained and crumpled, with a receipt dated from the previous night at 11:47 p.m. Inside were the remnants of a Big Mac meal, half-eaten, the fries still soft like they'd been sitting there for just a few hours. The smell hit us both at the same time, that distinctive fast food smell that definitely hadn't been there when I'd done laundry in the basement 2 days earlier. Kevin's face went pale, and he pulled out his phone to call the police while ushering me back upstairs, his hand on my back like he was afraid something might grab me if we didn't move fast enough. The police treated it like a standard break-in at first. Two officers who looked barely older than my nephew taking notes while walking through the house with their hands resting on their utility belts. They found the point of entry within 10 minutes, a basement window on the north side of the house where someone had carefully removed the security bar screws from the outside, the holes hidden behind a rhododendron bush that grew thick against the foundation. The frame showed fresh tool marks where someone had pried it open repeatedly, probably over several nights, working the lock mechanism until they'd figured out how to pop it silently. Officer Ramirez, the one with a thin scar through his left eyebrow, showed me how the intruder had been replacing the screws each time they left, making everything look normal from a casual glance. They documented everything, took photos, dusted for prints around the window and the boiler area, but both officers kept exchanging these looks that made my chest feel tight. When I asked what would happen next, Officer Carson, the younger one with freckles across his nose, said they'd increase patrols in the neighborhood, but admitted that without cameras or witnesses, catching someone who only came at night would be like finding a specific fish in Lake Superior. That afternoon, I spent $300 I didn't really have on security cameras from Best Buy, the kind that sent alerts to your phone when they detected motion. Kevin helped me set them up, one at each entrance, one in the hallway, and two in the basement, including one pointed directly at that window. We also moved my bedroom furniture so my bed sat against the far wall with clear sight lines to both the door and window, and Kevin insisted on installing this metal security bar that wedged under the doorknob, said he'd seen it on some crime show and it actually worked. Before he left, he tried to convince me to stay at his place for a while, but his wife had just had their third kid, and their house was already chaos without adding my drama to it. Instead, I promised to call him every night before bed and first thing in the morning, our own little check-in system that made us both feel better, even though we knew it wouldn't actually stop anything from happening. That first night with the cameras, I sat up in bed with my laptop open, watching the feeds like they were the most important TV show ever made, jumping every time a moth flew past the lens or the timestamp updated. For 3 nights, nothing happened except for a stray cat that triggered the basement camera and nearly gave me a heart attack at 3 a.m. when my phone started buzzing with motion alerts. I'd actually started to relax a little, thinking maybe the police visit had scared whoever it was away, that they'd moved on to some other house without cameras and paranoid owners who checked their locks 15 times before bed. Then on Friday night, exhausted from a week of barely sleeping, I made the mistake of taking 2 Benadryl to knock myself out, figuring the camera alerts would wake me if anything happened. I woke up Saturday morning feeling groggy and disoriented, my mouth dry like I'd been breathing through it all night, and when I checked my phone, there were 14 motion alerts from between 1:47 a.m. and 4:33 a.m. My fingers shook so bad I could barely unlock my phone, and when I finally got the camera app open, what I saw made me run to the bathroom and throw up the nothing that was in my stomach, just bile that burned my throat while tears streamed down my face. The footage showed a man entering through the basement window at 1:47 a.m., moving with the kind of confidence that comes from practice, like he'd done this so many times he could navigate my basement in the dark. He was wearing a baseball cap pulled low and what looked like a maintenance company jacket, the kind with reflective stripes that made him look like he belonged there if anyone happened to glance through a window. The infrared camera made his eyes look like white circles as he walked directly to the stairs, not hesitating, not searching, just walking like he owned the place. The hallway camera caught him at 2:15 a.m., standing at my bedroom door, his hand on the knob, just standing there for a full 4 minutes without moving. And I realized with horror that he was listening to me breathe, waiting to see if I was truly asleep. Then he opened the door so slowly that it took another 2 minutes for it to fully open and disappeared into my room where I didn't have a camera because who puts a camera in their own bedroom? The next footage was him leaving my room at 3:58 a.m., walking backward while carefully closing the door, and in his hand was my phone charger, the pink one with the butterfly sticker that I'd been looking for all week, assuming I'd misplaced it somewhere. I called 911 while still sitting on my bathroom floor, barely able to form words through the sobbing. And this time they sent 3 patrol cars and a detective named Heather Novak, who had this way of making me feel like she actually believed every word I said. When she watched the footage, she immediately recognized something I'd missed in my panic: a small tattoo on the man's left hand, a distinctive pattern that looked like interlocking triangles. She asked me about previous maintenance work on the house, and suddenly, it clicked. The property management company that handled the rental before Dorothy bought it had sent someone to service the boiler just 2 months before she died. Detective Novak made some calls, and within an hour, she had a name: Carl Brenner, 43 years old, who'd been fired from citywide property services 8 months ago for complaints about entering rental properties without notice. The company still had his photo on file, and even though the baseball cap obscured most of his face in my footage, that hand tattoo was unmistakable, those same interlocking triangles he'd apparently gotten during his time in the military, according to his employment records. They arrested Carl that same afternoon at his apartment in Fairfield, just 12 miles from my house, and what they found there made Detective Novak call me personally to come to the station, warning me I might want to bring someone for support. In a back room that Carl used as an office, they found hundreds of photos printed from a computer: photos of me sleeping, photos of me cooking dinner, photos of me watching TV on my couch, all taken from inside my house over the past month. But mixed in with mine were other photos, other women in other houses, some dating back 2 years, each set labeled with addresses and dates in neat handwriting on manila folders. He had keys to 17 different properties, including mine, which he'd apparently copied during his maintenance visits, and a notebook where he documented the routines of each house's occupants: when they slept, when they showered, when they were away at work. Detective Novak said in her 15 years on the force, she'd never seen anything quite like it. This methodical invasion of privacy that wasn't about theft or assault, but something else. Some need to exist in other people's spaces without their knowledge, to watch them in their most vulnerable moments. Carl never said a word during interrogation, just sat there with this blank expression, and eventually asked for a lawyer, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the prosecutor charged him with multiple counts of breaking and entering, stalking, and criminal trespass. The trial happened 6 months later, and by then I'd already moved back in with my sister, unable to sleep in that house even after changing every lock and installing an alarm system that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. During the proceedings, we learned that Carl had been doing this since his divorce in 2017, starting with his ex-wife's apartment, then expanding to places he'd serviced during his maintenance job. The prosecutor brought in a psychologist who testified about voyeuristic disorders and violation of privacy as a form of control, using words like parasitic intimacy that made everyone in the courtroom shift uncomfortably in their seats. 16 other women came forward to testify, each with their own version of my story: finding cigarette butts, missing small items, that persistent feeling that someone had been in their space. One woman from Oak Harbor broke down completely when she described finding an impression on her bed's comforter, where someone had laid down next to her while she slept, the shape still visible when she woke up one morning. Carl got 11 years in state prison, eligible for parole and 7 with good behavior, which seems like nothing compared to the life sentence he gave all of us, who can't look at an unlocked door or a basement window without remembering. I sold the house 3 months after the trial, taking a $15,000 loss just to be free of it, and the realtor had to disclose the stalking incident to potential buyers, which meant it sat on the market for 4 months before a young couple from out of state bought it, probably thinking they were getting a deal. Sometimes I drive by there, not intentionally, but that neighborhood sits between my sister's place and the grocery store I like, and I see they've painted it yellow, added a garden, normal life continuing in a space that still shows up in my nightmares. The thing that stays with me most isn't even the violation itself, but this one detail from the trial, where they showed a photo from Carl's apartment of a coffee mug he'd taken from my kitchen, my favorite one with a cartoon cat that said "Coffee right meow," sitting on his kitchen counter like it belonged there. He'd been drinking from it every morning while looking at those photos of me, creating this twisted parallel life where he inhabited my spaces even when he wasn't physically there. And that image haunts me more than any footage of him standing in my bedroom doorway, because it means that even when I thought I was alone and safe, some part of my life was always bleeding into his. September in that basement apartment felt like hiding from the world, which was exactly what I needed. Willow Drive wasn't much to look at, just rows of old houses converted into rentals, but at $600 a month I couldn't complain. 29 candles on my last birthday cake, and here I was, starting fresh after Janet and I called it quits. The landlord, an older guy named Frank, lived upstairs with his wife and kept to himself mostly. During move-in day, the neighbor from next door, Gregory, appeared at my door offering to help with the heavy stuff. He was probably in his 50s, thin guy with calloused hands, said he worked night shifts at some warehouse across town. Made a joke about how our basements were identical, just mirror images of each other, while we struggled to angle my couch down those narrow stairs. Even offered to lend me tools if I needed anything fixed, which seemed neighborly enough at the time. After about 2 weeks of living there, small things in my kitchen started seeming out of place. My coffee mug would be turned handle left when I always left it handle right. The wooden spoon I kept in the drawer next to the stove would migrate to the drawer by the sink. A jar of peanut butter I swore I'd pushed to the back of the cabinet would be sitting at the front edge when I got home from my accounting job downtown. Figured my brain was still scrambled from the divorce stress, especially since I was surviving on maybe 4 hours of sleep a night, scrolling through apartment listings for something better while trying to rebuild my savings. Started doubting myself, even wrote notes about where I put things. The kitchen was cramped, maybe 8 feet by 6 feet, old appliances that hummed too loud, cracked linoleum that curled at the edges. Then came that Wednesday in October when things got harder to explain away. Left for work at 7:30 sharp like always, and I specifically remember washing my breakfast bowl and placing it upside down on the dish rack. When I got home around 6 that evening, the bowl was right side up with 3 drops of water pooled at the bottom, not just moved but used. The dish soap bottle had shifted from the left side of the sink to the right, and there was a different sponge on the counter, still damp. Called Frank immediately, asked if he'd sent someone down for maintenance, or if maybe his wife had needed to check something. He sounded confused, said nobody had any reason to enter my apartment, reminded me I had the only key besides his emergency copy, which was hanging in his kitchen where it always stayed. That night I couldn't settle down. Kept getting up to double-check the deadbolt, even wedged a chair under the doorknob like my dad used to do when we stayed in sketchy motels during road trips. Around 2 in the morning, lying there in the dark, listening to the furnace cycle on and off, I heard something that made my whole body go rigid. The distinct sound of a drawer sliding open in my kitchen, that specific sticky catch the silverware drawer made because of the humidity. Then the soft rattle of utensils followed by the drawer rolling shut. My bedroom was only about 15 feet from the kitchen, just a thin wall between us. I held my breath, phone already in my hand, thumb hovering over the emergency call button. Could hear my pulse hammering in my ears while I waited, listening for footsteps, for any other sound. Another drawer opened, the one with the heavier sound, where I kept the dish towels and oven mitts. The intruder was methodical, unhurried, like someone familiar with the layout. I pressed 911, whispered to the dispatcher that someone was in my apartment, gave the address twice to make sure she got it right. She told me to stay where I was, keep the door locked, officers were on their way. But then I heard something that made no sense at all. The microwave door opened and closed, followed by the beep of buttons being pressed, but no hum of it actually running. Just someone pressing buttons in the dark. The fridge opened next, that broken seal making its characteristic sucking sound, and I could hear containers being shifted around, the clink of glass jars touching. The sirens came within 8 minutes, though it felt like hours lying there listening to someone moving through my kitchen, like they owned it. When the red and blue lights started flashing through those ground-level windows, the sounds stopped instantly. Not gradually, not with footsteps running away, just stopped like someone had hit a switch. The officers knocked loud, announcing themselves, and I practically ran to let them in, explaining about the sounds, pointing toward the kitchen. 2 of them went in with flashlights while a third stayed with me by the door. They checked everything, the closets, the bathroom, behind the water heater, even looked up at the ceiling tiles. The kitchen drawers were all closed, nothing visibly out of place, but I knew someone had been there. The younger officer, Officer Daniels, according to his badge, started asking about windows, pointing out that they were all locked from the inside with no signs of tampering. The door showed no damage either, deadbolt still solid. The older cop, Officer Ruiz, was running his flashlight along the walls, checking for any openings, when he stopped at the back corner of my bedroom. There was a section of wood paneling that looked slightly different from the rest, the grain pattern not quite matching. He pushed on it, and it gave way slightly, like it wasn't properly secured. Called his partner over, and together they pulled at the edges until the whole panel came loose, revealing a rough opening about 3 feet wide and 2 feet tall. Behind that panel was pure darkness that their flashlights couldn't quite penetrate at first. Officer Ruiz got down on his knees, aimed his light inside, and immediately pulled back, calling for backup on his radio. The crawl space extended beyond what the beam could reach, with fresh scuff marks in the dust and what looked like knee prints leading away from the opening. They told me to pack a bag, that I couldn't stay there tonight. While we waited for more officers, Gregory from next door came out in his bathrobe, asking about all the commotion, said the lights woke him up. Stood there on his porch with this concerned expression, arms crossed against the cold, watching everything unfold. Officer Daniels went to question him while Ruiz stayed with me, but Gregory just shook his head, said he'd been dead asleep until the sirens. When backup arrived with better equipment, they sent Officer Park, a smaller woman who volunteered to go through the crawl space with a helmet cam and heavy-duty flashlight. We watched the feed on a laptop in the police car, and my stomach turned as the tunnel curved left, then right, clearly man-made with support beams every few feet. After about 30 feet of crawling, she reached another opening, this one covered by a piece of thin plywood that pushed out easily. She emerged into what looked like another basement, and I heard her radio crackle as she described seeing a workbench with tools, shelving units, and a water heater in the corner. Then she turned her light toward the wall and found something that made everyone in the car go silent. Photos taped up in neat rows, dozens of them, all taken from inside my apartment. Me cooking dinner, washing dishes, even one of me sleeping on the couch after a long day. The detective who'd just arrived, Detective Morrison, immediately got a warrant for Gregory's house while Officer Park stayed in position. Within 20 minutes, they were at his door with the paperwork. Gregory answered calmly, like he'd been expecting them, didn't even protest when they told him to step outside. Inside his basement, exactly where Officer Park had emerged, they found the other end of the tunnel system. But it was what they found on his workbench that really got to me. My missing spare key from when I'd first moved in, the one I thought I'd misplaced while unpacking. A notebook with detailed schedules of when I left for work, when I got home, when I typically went to bed. Even had notes about my coffee preference and which drawer I kept the batteries in. The photos went back to my second day living there, hundreds of them organized by date in a filing cabinet. They arrested Gregory right there on his porch, didn't even let him go back inside for shoes. As they put him in the patrol car, he looked straight at me through the window, no expression at all, just staring like I was still something to observe. Detective Morrison told me later that Gregory had dug that tunnel over the course of 3 years, long before I'd moved in. The previous tenant, a college student named Ryan, had complained about missing food and moved out after just 2 months. But nobody had believed him about someone being in his apartment. They found photos of Ryan too, tucked in a separate folder, along with images of the tenant before him. Gregory had apparently been using that tunnel for years, treating whoever lived there like his personal reality show. Frank felt terrible about the whole thing, refunded my entire security deposit plus 2 months of rent, even though it wasn't his fault. He had contractors come seal up that wall with concrete, no more panels, no more access points. But I couldn't stay there. Moved in with a coworker for a few weeks until I found a studio apartment on the 3rd floor of a building downtown, one with cameras in the hallways and a doorman who worked nights. Gregory got 18 months for stalking and breaking and entering, which didn't feel like nearly enough. Sometimes I still wake up at 2 in the morning, listening for drawers opening, for sounds that shouldn't be there. Check my kitchen twice before bed, making sure everything is exactly where I left it. The therapist says it'll fade with time, that hypervigilance after something like this is normal. Maybe she's right, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never live in a basement again. Mason's mother had been gone for 3 months when the noises started in our basement, leaving just the 2 of us rattling around that split-level house outside Columbus. My son was 9, obsessed with collecting those little metal soldier figures that he'd line up in battle formations across his bedroom floor. We'd grabbed this place in a rush right before school started, one of those 80s builds with yellowish vinyl siding, and a furnace that sounded like it was clearing its throat every time it kicked on. The realtor had knocked $8,000 off the asking price because of the outdated kitchen and the basement that smelled like wet newspaper. But honestly, we just needed somewhere to start over. Mason claimed the upstairs bedroom while I took the master on the main floor, close enough to hear when those nightmares hit him around 2 or 3 in the morning, which happened more often than I'd like to admit. That first Monday in October, I remember specifically because Mason had just brought home straight A's on his report card. I woke up to this metallic scraping sound coming from below, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone filing down a piece of steel. The sound stopped and started in intervals, maybe 10 seconds of scraping, then silence, then scraping again. Mixed in with it, I could hear voices, 2 people having what sounded like a completely normal conversation, though the words were too muffled to make out through the floorboards. My first instinct was to check on Mason since he'd been sleepwalking lately, once even making it all the way to the kitchen where I found him trying to pour cereal at 3 in the morning. But when I cracked his door open, there he was, one arm dangling off the bed, mouth slightly open. Those dinosaur sheets twisted around his legs. The talking downstairs continued, casual and unhurried, like 2 guys discussing a project. I pulled the heavy mag light from my nightstand, the metal cold in my palm, and headed for the basement door off the kitchen. The second I turned the doorknob, everything went dead quiet, that kind of silence that feels intentional, like someone holding their breath. I waited there in my boxers and t-shirt, ear pressed against the door, counting to 30 in my head before flipping the light switch. Click. Nothing. The bulb was dead or missing, leaving just a black hole where the stairs descended. I aimed the mag light down those wooden steps, the beam cutting through dust particles that danced in the air like tiny insects. Each stair groaned under my weight, that old wood sound that makes you wonder if the whole thing might give way. The basement stretched out in front of me, mostly empty except for our moving boxes stacked against one wall, and that workbench the previous owners had left behind, its surface covered in rusty brackets and old paint cans. I swept the light across every corner, checking behind the water heater, around the furnace, even inside the utility closet where the electrical panel lived. Nobody. The concrete floor showed no footprints except my own dusty ones from when we'd moved boxes down there. But there was this smell I hadn't noticed before, kind of industrial, like machine oil mixed with something else, maybe rubber or heated plastic. The side door that led out to the backyard was still padlocked from the inside, the tiny window next to it so covered in grime you couldn't see through it even in daylight. For the next few nights I stayed up late, sitting in the living room with the TV on mute, just listening. The house had its regular sounds, the refrigerator humming, the heating ducts ticking as they cooled, but nothing from the basement. Started thinking maybe I'd dreamed the whole thing, or maybe it was mice in the walls, though mice don't usually have conversations. By Friday, I'd almost convinced myself to forget about it, Even joked with my coworker Phil about needing more coffee to stop hallucinating. Then the following Wednesday rolled around and everything changed. I'd taken a half day off work to deal with some paperwork at Mason's school. Something about updating emergency contact information now that his mother was out of the picture. Got back to the house around 1:30 in the afternoon, pulling into the driveway behind a white van I didn't recognize. No company logos, no writing on the sides, just a plain white panel van with tinted rear windows and a license plate so mud-covered I couldn't read it. Before I could even process why there was a van in my driveway, the side door of my basement burst open, and two men came walking out like they owned the place. Both wore those neon yellow reflective vests, the kind construction workers use, hard hats tucked under their arms carrying what looked like metal detectors or some kind of scanning equipment. The taller one, maybe 6'3" with a thick mustache that reminded me of a push broom, saw me getting out of my car and actually waved, casual as could be. The shorter guy, stocky with arms like ham hocks and a neck tattoo peeking out from his collar, was already heading toward the van's rear doors. They moved with this practiced efficiency, no hesitation, no surprise at seeing me, like running into the homeowner was just part of their regular routine. The tall one called out something about checking the lines, gestured vaguely toward the street where I could see orange cones set up that definitely hadn't been there when I left. I stood there for maybe 3 seconds, keys still in my hand, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. These guys had just walked out of my locked basement, the one with the padlock I'd checked myself that morning. The tall one was already at the van, sliding his equipment into the back while his partner climbed into the driver's seat. When I finally found my voice and asked what the hell they were doing in my house, the tall one just pointed at his vest like that explained everything. Mumbled something about Columbia Gas checking for leaks. Routine maintenance. Should have gotten a notice. His partner had already started the engine, revving it impatiently, and before I could ask another question, the tall guy hopped in and they peeled out, leaving tire marks on my driveway. The whole encounter lasted maybe 45 seconds, but something about how smooth it was, how rehearsed, made every alarm bell in my head go off at once. I ran to the basement door, still standing wide open, the padlock dangling from the hasp, somehow unlocked. The mechanism wasn't broken or cut, just opened clean, like they had a key or picked it with professional tools. Down in the basement, that industrial smell hit me stronger than before, and I noticed things I'd missed in the dark with just my flashlight. Fresh scratches on the concrete floor near the wall, like something heavy had been dragged. A section of drywall in the corner looked newer than the rest, the paint slightly brighter white, the texture different. One of our moving boxes had been shifted, and when I checked inside, someone had gone through our old photo albums, a few pictures scattered on the floor beneath the box. The pictures were all of Mason as a baby, birthday parties, first day of kindergarten, him with his mother before she left. My chest got tight seeing those photos touched by strangers' hands, and I grabbed my phone to call the police, but then stopped, realizing how insane this would sound without proof. Instead, I called Columbia Gas first, going through 3 different customer service representatives, before reaching someone who could actually check service records. The woman on the phone, Sharon, sounded increasingly concerned as she searched their system, finally telling me in this careful voice that no Columbia Gas crews had been dispatched to my address in over 2 years, and certainly not today. She asked if I wanted to file a report about impersonation, said it was a serious crime, that people sometimes posed as utility workers to case houses for burglaries. While she was talking, I walked around the basement perimeter, running my hand along the walls, and that's when I felt it. A draft coming from behind that newer section of drywall. Not strong, but definitely there. Cold air flowing from somewhere it shouldn't be. Sharon was still talking about security protocols when I grabbed a screwdriver from the workbench and started prying at the edge of that fresh drywall section. The drywall came away easier than it should have, just held in place with a few finishing nails, revealing a hole about 3 feet wide cut straight through the concrete foundation. Professional work, smooth edges, probably done with a concrete saw, the kind contractors use for major renovations. Beyond the hole was a corrugated metal pipe, one of those big storm drain tubes that run under neighborhoods to handle rainwater runoff. The pipe had to be at least 4 feet in diameter, big enough for a grown man to walk through if he hunched over a bit. I could see footprints in the sediment at the bottom, lots of them, going both directions, and that industrial smell was overwhelming now, mixing with the musty stench of stagnant water and decay. My flashlight beam couldn't reach the end of the tunnel in either direction, just disappeared into blackness that seemed to go on forever. Called 911 right then, told them about the break-in, the fake utility workers, and this tunnel I'd just discovered leading straight into the storm drain system. The cops showed up within 10 minutes, 2 patrol cars and then a detective in an unmarked sedan who introduced himself as Detective Hoffman. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, wearing a wrinkled suit that looked like he'd slept in it, but his eyes were sharp, taking in every detail as I walked him through what happened. When he saw the tunnel opening, he immediately called for backup and a crime scene unit, then got on his radio requesting someone from the city's public works department. While we waited, he asked me detailed questions about the 2 men, had me describe everything I could remember, their height, weight, distinguishing features, the van, even the way they walked. The crime scene techs arrived and started photographing everything, dusting for prints on the drywall edges and the padlock, taking samples of the sediment from inside the tunnel entrance. One of them, a woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, told Hoffman she could see tool marks on the concrete, definitely a professional job, probably took days to cut through. The guy from Public Works showed up about an hour later, an older man named Eddie who'd been working the city sewers for 23 years, knew every pipe and drain in Columbus like the back of his hand. He took one look at the tunnel entrance and his face went pale, started muttering about how this section of storm drain had been sealed off in 2016 after a homeless camp got flooded out during heavy rains. Said the city had welded shut all the access points, installed security grates, the whole 9 yards, specifically to keep people from getting in there. But here was proof someone had not only gotten in but had been using it as their own private highway under the neighborhood. Eddie pulled up schematics on his tablet, showing Hoffman where the drain ran, and my stomach dropped when I saw it connected to at least 12 other houses on our street, with multiple entry points that led to maintenance hatches scattered throughout the area. Any of those houses could have the same kind of hidden entrance, and the people living there would never know. Hoffman made the decision to send officers into the tunnel while we evacuated to a hotel. Said it wasn't safe for Mason and me to stay there until they figured out what they were dealing with. I packed bags for both of us while trying not to alarm Mason. Told him we were having an adventure, like camping but in a hotel with a pool. Poor kid was excited about the pool, had no idea why his dad's hands were shaking while folding his dinosaur pajamas. Before we left, I watched them send in 2 officers wearing hazmat suits and headlamps, tethered to safety lines in case the tunnel had any surprises. They came back out 20 minutes later with evidence bags full of stuff they'd found down there. Copper piping that had been stripped from somewhere, what looked like mail from different addresses, even a laptop in a waterproof case. One of the officers, his face sheet white despite the exertion, told Hoffman they'd found makeshift camps set up at various points, sleeping bags, camp stoves, stockpiles of food, and something else that made him stop talking when he noticed I was listening. Hoffman walked me to my car, said they'd post an officer at the hotel, gave me his card with his personal cell number written on the back, told me to call if I remembered anything else or if anyone tried to contact me. That night at the hotel, Mason splashed in the pool while I sat on a plastic chair watching him, my phone buzzing every few minutes with updates from Hoffman. They'd arrested 6 people by midnight, all found at different points in the tunnel system, including the 2 guys I'd described from my driveway. The tall one with the mustache turned out to be a former city employee who'd been fired from the water department 5 years ago for stealing equipment. His partner was his cousin, both of them with rap sheets full of burglary and theft charges going back a decade. The other 4 were people nobody expected, a woman who worked at a nearby grocery store, 2 brothers who ran a scrap metal business, and most disturbing, a man who'd been reported missing by his family 3 years ago. They'd been living down there, had turned that abandoned storm drain into their own underground network, complete with stolen electricity tapped from junction boxes and water siphoned from supply lines. The metallic scraping I'd heard that first night was them cutting through pipes in neighboring basements, harvesting copper to sell, and the talking was them planning which house to hit next. What really got me was when Hoffman called the next morning to tell me what else they'd discovered. Those photos of Mason they'd been looking through weren't random curiosity. They'd found notebooks in one of the camps with detailed information about every family on our street, schedules, when people left for work, when kids got home from school, who had dogs, who had security systems. My house was marked as single father, 1 child, no dog, basic locks, basement access confirmed. They'd been watching us for weeks before they even cut through our foundation, knew exactly when they could work without being heard, knew I wouldn't be home that Wednesday afternoon because they'd seen me leave at the same time the previous week for Mason's school appointment. The whole operation was sophisticated in a way that made my skin prickle. These weren't just random criminals, but people who'd turned violating others' homes into a science. The city ended up evacuating the entire street for a week, while they sealed every access point with reinforced concrete, installed monitoring equipment, and swept the whole system for anyone else who might be down there. They found 2 more people on the 3rd day, living so deep in the system they hadn't even known about the arrests, surviving on canned goods and rainwater like some kind of post-apocalyptic scenario playing out beneath our suburban street. We never went back to that house. I broke the lease, took the financial hit, didn't care about losing the security deposit or the penalties. Found us the apartment on the 7th floor of a building downtown, one with a doorman, security cameras in every hallway, and most importantly, no basement. Mason adjusted better than I expected, though he still asks sometimes why we had to move so suddenly, why we couldn't go back for the rest of his toys. I tell him the house had problems. Leave it at that. Figure when he's older I'll explain the whole thing if he really wants to know. The nightmares he'd been having after his mother left actually stopped after we moved. Like somehow his subconscious knew we were safer in that concrete tower than we'd ever been in that house with its hidden vulnerabilities. All 8 people they arrested got prison time, sentences ranging from 18 months to 7 years for the ringleaders, though that feels like nothing compared to the violation they put our whole neighborhood through. 6 months later, I ran into one of our old neighbors at a Kroger across town, a woman named Beth who'd lived 3 houses down from us. She told me they'd sold too, couldn't sleep knowing what had been happening literally beneath their feet all that time. Said the whole street had basically emptied out within a year, property values tanked, and the city was still dealing with lawsuits from families who'd discovered evidence of intrusion in their homes during the investigation. Pictures missing, items moved, food taken from refrigerators, little violations that suddenly made sense in the context of what had been discovered. She mentioned they'd found DNA evidence in 7 different houses, proving the tunnel people had been coming up into homes for months, maybe years, whenever they knew families were away. The strangest part was learning later from the prosecution files that the man who'd been missing for 3 years, the one living in the tunnels, had actually chosen to be there, had left his family to join this underground community because he believed society above ground was collapsing. Even now, writing this at my desk in our new place with the city lights twinkling outside, I still check the locks 3 times before bed, still wake up at the slightest unusual sound, still feel that primitive fear when I hear something that reminds me of metal scraping against concrete. The notification from Roomshare popped up on my phone during a particularly rough month in 2022, right when Jenna and I were staring at our credit card statements spread across the kitchen table. We'd bought the house in Denver the previous year, convinced we could handle the mortgage on our combined salaries. But between the car breaking down and her dad's medical bills, things had gotten tight. The basement had its own entrance around the side of the house, a full bathroom, and enough space for someone to live comfortably, So when Jenna suggested renting it out, I figured why not. The app made everything seem so easy and safe, with background checks and verified profiles. And within 3 days, we had our first serious inquiry from someone named Thomas Brennan, who said he worked nights at a warehouse and just needed a quiet place to sleep during the day. Thomas showed up on a Saturday morning to view the space, and I remember thinking how unremarkable he looked. Just an average guy in his 40s with thinning brown hair and clothes that seemed deliberately chosen to blend in, khakis and a plain blue polo shirt. He barely spoke above a whisper when he talked, had this way of nodding along to everything we said, and paid 3 months up front in cash, which should have been my first red flag, but honestly just felt like a relief at the time. He moved in with just 2 suitcases and a laptop bag, said he traveled light because of his job, and for the first couple weeks everything seemed perfect. He was so quiet we sometimes forgot he was even down there, never asked for anything, never complained about the old water heater that made that weird knocking sound, and always left his rent money in an envelope taped to our back door on the 1st of each month, even though I told him he could just transfer it through the app. About a month in, Jenna started mentioning these little things that didn't quite add up, like how she'd never heard him use the microwave or the TV we'd left down there, never smelled food cooking, never heard water running except for the toilet flushing occasionally. She worked from home doing medical transcription and said the basement was dead silent all day, even though Thomas supposedly slept during those hours after his night shifts. We'd see him leaving around 9 at night through the side entrance, always carrying the same black backpack, always wearing dark clothes, and he'd return around 6 in the morning, though sometimes I'd catch glimpses of movement through the basement window at odd hours when he should have been at work. The strangest part was the darkness. We never saw lights on down there, not even the glow from a phone screen or laptop, just complete blackness behind those small rectangular windows at ground level. One evening I went down to check the water meter, which was in a utility closet in the basement hallway, and noticed Thomas had installed a deadbolt on his door from the inside, one of those heavy-duty ones you'd see on a front door. When I knocked to ask about it, just making conversation really, he opened the door maybe 3 inches, his face partially hidden in the shadows, and explained in that soft voice that he had expensive equipment for his work and felt better with extra security. The smell that came from his room was odd, not bad exactly, but sharp and chemical, like fresh plastic mixed with something metallic, and I could hear this faint humming sound, maybe a fan or some kind of machine running. He must have seen me trying to peer past him because he shifted his body to block my view completely, then thanked me for understanding about the lock and gently closed the door before I could respond. Jenna had this habit of doing yoga in our bedroom every morning, and one day in early December she came downstairs looking puzzled, saying she kept hearing these tiny clicking sounds while she was in downward dog, like someone tapping a pencil against wood but coming from below. Our bedroom was directly above Thomas's living area, and when we both went upstairs to listen, sure enough, there were these intermittent clicking noises, so faint you had to really concentrate to hear them. I figured maybe he had some kind of hobby, model building or something. People who work nights often have unusual ways to unwind, but Jenna started changing in the bathroom after that. Said she just felt weird about it, even though there was no logical reason. We also noticed our cat, Mango, absolutely refused to go near the basement door anymore, would hiss and arch his back if we even carried him close to it, which was bizarre because he used to love sleeping on the warm spot where the heating vent came up through the floor there. The night everything went to hell started with me jerking awake at 2 in the morning to the sound of water rushing through the walls, that unmistakable whoosh that means a pipe has given way somewhere. I grabbed a flashlight and ran to the basement door, pounding on it and shouting for Thomas, but got no response, even though his car was in the driveway. The water was already seeping under the door into our hallway, and I could hear it spraying full force somewhere below. I threw my shoulder against the door hard. Once, twice, and on the third hit the frame splintered, and the deadbolt ripped free from the wood. The basement was pitch black, and my flashlight beam caught the water first, cascading from a burst pipe in the ceiling, soaking everything. But as I swung the light around looking for the shutoff valve, I saw something that made my brain just stop processing for a second. The ceiling was covered in holes, dozens of them, each about the width of a quarter, drilled in precise patterns across the drywall. Some had thin cables snaking through them, others were plugged with what looked like small glass lenses, and all of them were positioned directly under the rooms where Jenna and I spent our time. My flashlight caught more details as I stood there in shock. A desk covered in monitors showing grainy green-tinted footage, boxes of electronic equipment I couldn't identify, and notebooks filled with handwritten schedules and observations. The monitors were still running on battery backup, and I could see our living room from above, our kitchen, and worst of all, our bedroom, all filmed from those tiny holes he'd so carefully hidden in the textured ceiling upstairs. One screen showed Jenna asleep in our bed at that very moment, and another had folders labeled with dates going back to the day Thomas moved in. I heard footsteps on the stairs behind me, and Thomas was suddenly there. Not in work clothes, but in dark athletic gear, his face completely different without the meek expression he usually wore, now sharp and focused and calculating. He didn't say anything, just looked at me, then at his equipment, then back at me, like he was doing math in his head about what would happen next. I started backing toward the door, keeping the flashlight aimed at his face, and told him the police were already on their way, which was a lie but seemed like the right thing to say. He smiled then, not the nervous smile I'd seen before, but something confident and practiced, and said in a voice much deeper than his usual whisper that I had no idea how many places he'd been, or how many people had thought they were safe in their own homes. Then he moved faster than I expected, not toward me, but to his desk, grabbing something before sprinting past me and up the stairs, shoving me hard into the wall as he went. By the time I got upstairs, Jenna was standing in the hallway with her phone, saying she'd heard the crash and already called 911, but Thomas was gone, the front door wide open and cold December air rushing in. His car was still in the driveway, which meant he'd fled on foot, probably had another vehicle stashed nearby or someone waiting to pick him up. The whole thing planned out like everything else he'd done. The police arrived within minutes, and I took them down to the basement, which was now ankle-deep in water from the still gushing pipe. But the equipment was still there, those monitors still glowing with their sick green light, showing every private moment we thought we'd had. The detective who specialized in these cases told us to pack some things and find somewhere else to stay for a few days while they processed the scene. Said Thomas had likely been recording everything for months, possibly selling the footage or just keeping it for his own twisted reasons. The investigation revealed things that still make me nauseous when I think about them, like how Thomas Brennan wasn't even his real name, just one of at least 6 identities they could trace. The detective showed us photos from other rental properties in Colorado and Wyoming, where similar setups had been found. Always basement apartments, always couples or single women living above, always the same pattern of holes drilled with surgical precision. They found receipt copies in his desk for specialty surveillance equipment, ordered to different addresses, some dating back 3 years, and a laptop with encrypted files the FBI tech team was still trying to crack. The worst part was learning from the neighbors that they'd seen someone matching his description at odd hours, sometimes just standing in our backyard at night, looking up at our windows, and they'd assumed it was just the tenant getting some air, nothing worth mentioning. We stayed in a hotel for a week while contractors repaired the water damage and patched all those holes, though knowing where each one had been still makes my skin itch when I walk through the house. Jenna couldn't sleep for months, would wake up checking the ceiling with her phone's flashlight, convinced she could hear that clicking sound again, even though Thomas was long gone. We had a security system installed, cameras covering every angle of the property, motion sensors, the whole deal, which felt ironic given what had happened, trading one form of surveillance for another. The detective called a few times with updates, said they'd connected Thomas to at least 12 similar cases across 4 states, but he'd vanished completely, probably using another identity they hadn't uncovered yet, maybe already setting up in another basement somewhere, drilling his neat little holes while some unsuspecting couple slept above him. 6 months later, I was grabbing coffee downtown when I swear I saw him across the street. Same height, same thinning hair, wearing those generic clothes meant to blend into any crowd. My whole body went rigid, and I stood there watching as he walked into a hardware store, probably buying more drill bits, more tiny cameras, more cables to snake through someone else's ceiling. I called the detective immediately, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone, and the store's security footage showed someone who looked similar but not quite the same, though the detective admitted these guys were experts at changing their appearance just enough to create doubt. We ended up selling the house 2 months after that. Took a loss on it, but didn't care. Just needed to be somewhere he'd never been. Somewhere without a basement. Somewhere we could shower and sleep and live without wondering what might be watching from inside the walls. The new buyers were a young family with kids, and I wanted to warn them, to tell them everything. But my lawyer said we'd disclosed what we legally had to, and anything more might be seen as trying to sabotage the sale. So I just handed over the keys and hoped they'd never need to find out why we'd installed so many locks. The conference in Seattle wasn't something I could skip, not with the promotion hanging in the balance and my boss watching every move I made. Hotels downtown were charging $300 a night minimum, which would have blown through my travel allowance in 2 days. So I scrolled through Airbnb until I found something reasonable. $60 a night for a whole house seemed too good to pass up, even if it meant a 40-minute drive to the convention center each morning. The listing showed a charming craftsman-style place with original hardwood floors and vintage fixtures, the kind of house my grandmother would have loved. The host, Martin, had stellar reviews, mostly from business travelers like me who praised his quick responses in the peaceful neighborhood. I booked 5 nights without hesitation, figuring I'd just need a clean bed and a hot shower after 12-hour days at the conference. Martin met me at the house on Sunday evening, right as the October rain started picking up. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, with perfectly combed hair and clothes that looked like he'd ironed them twice. His handshake lasted a beat too long, and he maintained this intense eye contact while explaining the house rules, like he was trying to memorize my face. The place was exactly as advertised, maybe even nicer, with fresh flowers on the dining table and a welcome basket full of local coffee and snacks. He walked me through each room, pointing out the thermostat, the Wi-Fi password taped to the router, the extra towels in the linen closet. When we reached the hallway, he stopped at a white door near the kitchen and his whole demeanor shifted. His voice dropped lower, more serious, as he explained that this was the basement door, and it needed to stay locked at all times. Something about ongoing renovations, exposed wiring, insurance liability, the usual concerns that property owners have. He actually pulled on the handle to show me it was secured, then watched me nod in understanding before his smile returned. The first 2 nights passed without incident. I'd leave early for the conference, grabbing coffee from the kitchen while the house sat silent in the pre-dawn darkness, and return after 10 each night, too exhausted to do anything but shower and collapse into bed. The house had this settled quietness that old places develop, with the occasional creak of wood, adjusting to temperature changes, or pipes ticking behind the walls. On Monday night, I'd actually stood in the hallway eating takeout Chinese food, staring at that basement door while wondering what kind of renovation required such strict warnings. The door looked ancient, with layers of white paint that had yellowed at the edges, and an old-fashioned keyhole beneath the modern deadbolt Martin had installed. I even bent down once to peek through the keyhole, seeing nothing but black, before feeling ridiculous and heading to bed. Wednesday changed everything. The conference ended early due to a speaker cancellation, so I got back to the house around 6 instead of my usual 10:30. I decided to take advantage of the extra time, pouring myself wine from a bottle I'd bought and settling onto the couch with my laptop to review presentations. The house felt different in the evening light, more lived in somehow, like someone had just stepped out for groceries. Around 8, while I was deep in a spreadsheet, I heard this rhythmic creaking from somewhere below. My first thought was the washing machine, maybe on an automatic cycle, but Martin hadn't mentioned any appliances in the basement. The sound continued for maybe 10 minutes, steady and deliberate, like footsteps pacing back and forth on old wooden stairs. I actually muted my laptop and pressed my ear to the floor, trying to locate the source. But the moment I did, the sound stopped completely, as if someone down there had heard me listening. I texted Martin about the noise, trying to keep it casual, asking if there was any automated equipment in the basement that might be running. He replied within seconds, which struck me as odd for 8 at night, saying it was probably just the old boiler system settling for the evening and apologizing if it disturbed my work. His response should have been reassuring, but the speed of it, like he'd been waiting for my message, made me uneasy. I went back to my spreadsheets, but concentration was impossible. Every small sound made me look up, and I found myself glancing repeatedly at that hallway where the basement door waited. Around 9, I heard what sounded like metal scraping against wood, just once. Brief but distinct. I grabbed my phone to text Martin again, but stopped, realizing how paranoid I'd sound complaining about every little noise in an old house. That night, I couldn't fall asleep. I lay in the darkness of the guest bedroom, listening to the house breathe around me, trying to separate normal settling sounds from anything else. Sometime after midnight, maybe closer to 1, I heard the definitive sound of footsteps beneath the floorboards. Not the random creaking of old wood, but a clear pattern. 7 steps one way, a pause, 7 steps back. The counting became automatic, something my brain did without permission, and with each repetition, the pause grew longer. During one of these pauses, I heard something that made me sit straight up in bed. The distinct sound of a doorknob turning, that specific metallic click and release. I knew immediately which door it was, even from the bedroom. My phone was in my hand before I'd made the conscious decision to grab it, thumb hovering over the emergency call button while I strained to hear what would come next. The footsteps that followed were different, heavier and more deliberate, moving through the hallway toward the living room. I could track them by the way different floorboards complained under the weight, each creak mapping out a path through the house I'd walked myself just hours earlier. They stopped near the couch where I'd been working, and I heard the unmistakable sound of papers rustling. My work documents were still spread across the coffee table, including contracts with my company's letterhead, my business cards, even my travel itinerary with my home address printed at the top. The silence that followed felt deliberate, like someone reading, absorbing information. Then came a sound that nearly made me call out, the wine glass I'd left on the table being picked up and set down again, the faint ring of glass meeting wood echoing in the darkness. I did the stupidest thing possible. I got out of bed and crept to the bedroom door, pressing my face against the wood to listen better. The living room was maybe 20 feet away, a straight shot down the hallway, and whoever was out there would only need to turn the corner to see my door. But I had to know if this was real or if I was having some kind of exhaustion-induced breakdown. My hand found the doorknob, turned it with excruciating slowness to avoid any sound, and I opened the door just enough to peer out with one eye. The hallway was dark, but streetlight from the living room windows created this dim gray twilight, enough to see shapes and shadows. And there, standing beside the coffee table with my papers in his hands, was Martin. He was wearing different clothes than when he'd met me on Sunday, a worn undershirt and sweatpants like he'd been sleeping. But what made me pull back and nearly gasp aloud was realizing he was barefoot, and his feet were dirty, covered in what looked like dust or soil, leaving faint prints on the hardwood floor. I closed the door with infinite care, turned the lock so slowly that it took nearly 30 seconds for the bolt to fully engage, then backed away until my legs hit the bed. My mind was racing through possibilities, each more insane than the last. Maybe he'd forgotten something important and had a spare key. Maybe there was an emergency. Maybe he was checking on the property. But none of that explained why he'd come through the basement or why he was going through my personal papers at 1 a.m. I could hear him moving again, those dirty feet padding across the floor toward the kitchen. The refrigerator opened, stayed open for maybe a minute, then closed. Water ran in the sink. Normal sounds that became terrifying because they shouldn't be happening. I started recording video on my phone, not of him, but of the door crack where light might show movement, evidence that I wasn't imagining this. The next sound was worse than anything before. The squeak of weight settling onto the couch springs, like he was making himself comfortable in the living room. I could picture him out there, maybe still holding my papers, sitting in the dark just 30 feet from where I was hiding. My phone showed 1:47 a.m., and I made the decision to wait him out, to stay locked in this room until daylight, then get out and never come back. But around 2:30, after nearly an hour of silence, I heard him stand and walk back toward the hallway. The footsteps paused right outside my door, and I swear I could hear breathing. This slow, measured rhythm, like someone trying to detect signs of consciousness from within. My own breath stopped entirely, my whole body rigid under the covers where I dove the moment he'd started moving. The doorknob rattled once, just a gentle test, finding it locked. Then nothing for maybe 5 minutes. Absolute stillness before those footsteps retreated back toward the kitchen, and that basement door opened and closed with its familiar creak. I didn't sleep, not for 1 second. I sat on that bed with my back against the headboard, phone clutched in both hands, watching the door and listening to every sound the house made for the rest of the night. When gray dawn light finally crept through the curtains, I threw everything into my suitcase without folding anything, not caring about wrinkles or organization. I waited until 6:30, when the neighborhood would have people heading to work, witnesses around if something went wrong, then unlocked my door and walked straight to my car without looking anywhere but forward. Before driving away, though, I had to know. I walked around the back of the house, my keys gripped between my fingers like claws, until I found it. A storm door cellar entrance, the kind with angled metal doors that lead from outside directly into the basement. The padlock that should have secured it was hanging open, and there were fresh scrape marks in the dirt, where the doors had been repeatedly opened. The grass around it was worn down to bare earth in a rough path that led to a cluster of trees where the property line ended. When the police searched the basement 3 hours later, after I'd called them from a Starbucks parking lot 10 miles away, they found a makeshift living space behind the boiler. A sleeping bag, camp stove, boxes of canned food, and a milk crate full of items taken from previous guests. A watch, several driver's licenses, pieces of jewelry, phone chargers, even underwear. Martin had been living down there for months, they said, entering through that outside entrance and moving through the house at night while guests slept above him. The detective who called me later said they'd found notebooks where he'd written detailed observations about each guest, what time they went to bed, their daily routines, phone conversations he'd overheard through the floorboards. My name was already there, along with notes about my conference schedule and a sketch of my face that was disturbingly accurate. They arrested him at his actual apartment across town, where he'd been maintaining the appearance of a normal life while essentially living beneath his rental property, surfacing at night like some kind of human rodent to study the people who'd paid him to feel safe. There are nights when silence feels heavier than usual, like the whole house is waiting for something to happen. I remember one of those nights vividly, mostly because it started out so ordinary. I had just come home after another long evening shift at the diner where I worked. My routine was always the same: drop my keys on the counter, kick off my shoes, and heat up whatever leftovers were still in the fridge. That night, though, when I walked through the kitchen, I noticed a faint glow coming from the hallway that led to the basement door. The light was on down there, which didn't make sense. I never used the basement except to store tools and boxes that hadn't been touched in years. At first, I laughed it off, thinking I must have flipped the switch by accident one morning when I was half awake. Still, something about that dim yellow light spilling under the door made me uneasy. The basement always had this strange, still air about it, like time stopped at the bottom of those steps. I opened the door and stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself I was just being ridiculous. The bulb buzzed faintly, casting long shadows over the concrete floor. I almost turned it off right then, but curiosity got the better of me. When I went down, I noticed how thick the dust layer had gotten since the last time I'd been there. You could see every small print from mice, the outline of old pipes, and my own footprints from months ago. Near the far wall, close to the furnace, I spotted something new. A few half-formed boot prints, much larger than my own. The shape was distinct, almost recent, like someone had walked there not long ago and disturbed the dust just enough to leave a clear mark. I told myself maybe the plumber had left them when he came by earlier that year, but deep down, I knew he never walked that far in. That image of those footprints stuck with me the rest of the night. I went back upstairs, double-checked every lock, and tried to sleep with the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. But around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a faint metallic sound echoing through the vents, like something lightly brushing against the inside of the ducts. Came again, slower this time, followed by a hollow tap that seemed to move across the house. I stared at the ceiling, counting each sound, pretending it was just the heating system settling. But the truth was, I had never heard those noises before. The next morning, I checked the basement again, hoping to find something that would make sense of the noise. Everything looked the same cold air, same quiet hum from the furnace. Still, I could not stop staring at those footprints. I knelt down, touched the dust, and realized the top layer seemed freshly disturbed again, like someone had stepped there after I had gone upstairs. I told myself it must have been airflow from the vents, or maybe a small animal. But that explanation did not sit right. The house was sealed up tight, and I had not seen a single mouse in years. 2 nights later, the metallic sounds returned, sharper this time. They moved from one vent to another, like something crawling through the ductwork. Then came a faint whiff of cigarette smoke. It was so subtle that I almost ignored it, but the smell lingered long enough for me to notice where it came from, the vent near my bed. I sat there for what felt like an hour, just listening. The furnace was off. The house was still. But that smell, cheap, acrid tobacco, seeped out from below, mixing with the stale air of my room. I could not remember the last time anyone had smoked inside this house. I barely slept that night, and when dawn came, I decided to check the basement again. The air down there was heavier, colder, and the smell of smoke was stronger. I noticed a few ashes on the concrete near the furnace, tiny gray flakes scattered close to the vent opening. That was when I noticed something odd behind the furnace. There was a narrow panel of metal, slightly misaligned. When I crouched and looked closer, I realized it was not part of the furnace at all, but a piece of sheet metal wedged over a small opening in the wall. Behind it, a dark void stretched deeper than I could see. I hesitated before pulling it aside. The sound of my own breathing filled the room. When I finally shifted the metal enough to look inside, a faint draft hit my face, cool and stale. The crawl space was cramped and uneven, with old insulation hanging like cobwebs. I shined my phone's flashlight in and saw a few things that made my chest tighten. A crumpled blanket, an empty can of beans, and a half-burned cigarette resting on a brick. Someone had been staying down there, watching, listening. I backed away slowly, not sure what to do next. I stood there, gripping the edge of the furnace, trying to wrap my head around what I was seeing. It was not just that someone had been living down there. It was that they had been close enough to hear everything I did. Every step, every door opening, every phone call. I thought about the faint sounds I'd brushed off for weeks. It all fit together now in the worst possible way. The vent outside must have been their entrance, hidden behind the shrubs near the side of the house. I never noticed it before because I hardly went back there. I backed away and called the police, my voice trembling as I tried to explain. The dispatcher told me to wait outside until officers arrived. Standing in the driveway, I could see the faint glow of my basement light through the small window near the ground. It was strange, knowing that someone might still be in there, maybe watching me from the shadows. When the officers finally arrived, they went inside with flashlights and weapons drawn. I heard one of them yell something, followed by the sound of boots pounding against the floor. They pulled out a man who looked like he had not slept in days. His clothes were filthy, and his eyes darted around like a cornered animal's. The officers said he had been sneaking in at night through the vent, hiding in that crawl space whenever I was home. There were food wrappers, cigarette butts, and even a small radio tuned to static. He had made himself comfortable in my walls, using the ducts to listen to me move from room to room. The realization made my chest feel hollow. I had been living above him, completely unaware, for who knows how long. After they took him away, I had every vent sealed and the crawl space welded shut. The house felt different after that. Quieter, but not in a peaceful way. Sometimes late at night, I still catch myself glancing toward the basement door, half expecting to see that faint yellow light seeping out again. It has been months since it happened, but I cannot shake the feeling that the silence in this house is not empty anymore. It feels like it is waiting, listening, just like he once did.